Constantine the Great, that is the name on the stained glass. The emperor the church made into a hero. In churches and seminary textbooks from Tennessee to Rome, he appears the way founding figures always appear, as the man whose faith changed history, the first Christian emperor, the ruler whose conversion opened the Roman world to the gospel, the man who built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, who convened the Council of Nicaea, who gave Christianity its first real political victory in 4 centuries of Roman power. Those things are true, all of them. Constantine did all of those things. He was also baptized for the first time in his life in 337 AD, at the age of 65, on his deathbed. I want you to hold those two things together for a moment. A man who spent 25 years building the institutional infrastructure of Christianity, councils, churches, legal status, political weight, and who had never, during any of those 25 years, been baptized. Never initiated, never formally received into the faith whose architecture he was constructing. In the theological system he was busy defining, he was not a Christian. He was a catechumen at best, a candidate, a man standing in the vestibule of the building he had built. I want to take you through what the documents actually say about those 25 years, not the stained glass version, the document version, what the coins say, what the biographies say, what the baptismal record says, what the timing of a ceremony on a deathbed, administered by a specific bishop with a specific theological history, actually tells us about the man the church chose as its founding patron. Because the evidence is there, it has always been there. It just requires following it where it leads. The story that the church built the conversion on is the Battle of Milvian Bridge, October 28, 312 AD. Constantine's forces faced the army of Maxentius for control of Rome. According to tradition, the night before the battle, Constantine receives a divine communication, a sign, a vision, a command, to fight under the symbol of Christ. He marks his soldiers' shields with the Chiro, the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek. He wins. He attributes the victory to the Christian God. That is the outline. Here is where it gets complicated. We have 2 primary sources for what happened that night. 2 accounts written within decades of the event by men who had access to Constantine's court and to his own statements about what occurred. The first is Lactantius, a Christian rhetorician who tutored Constantine's son and was present at court during those years. He wrote De Mortibus Persecutorum, on the deaths of the persecutors, around 315 AD, 3 years after the battle. He describes what Constantine received the night before Milvian Bridge as a dream. In the dream, Constantine was commanded to place a heavenly sign on his soldiers' shields. He did so. He won. A dream. A private night vision. Lactantius, 3 years after the event, recording a dream. The second is Eusebius of Caesarea, Constantine's official biographer, a bishop who had been in correspondence with Constantine for years and who spent extended time at court. He wrote the Vita Constantini, the life of Constantine, around 337 AD, 25 years after the battle. His account has grown considerably in the telling. In Eusebius's version, Constantine did not dream. He was riding in the afternoon sun when he saw, in the sky above the sun, a luminous cross with an inscription reading, "By this conquer." That evening, Christ appeared to him and instructed him to use the sign as a military standard. The following morning, Constantine told his entire army what he had seen. The entire army, hundreds of thousands of men, all of them witnesses to Constantine announcing a heavenly vision the previous afternoon. 2 accounts, 3 years versus 25 years, a private dream versus a public vision in the sky above the sun, with a written inscription and an army of witnesses. Lactantius, who was there during those years, describes one thing. Eusebius, writing a quarter century later as the emperor's official biographer, describes something significantly more dramatic and considerably more public. When 2 primary sources tell different stories about the same event, that is not confirmation. That is a question. The useful question is, why did the story grow? I spent 35 years teaching history. I know what primary sources do over time when a community needs them to carry weight they were not originally built to carry. The story grows toward what the community needs. Lactantius gives you a dream adequate for a military commander who made a strategic decision. Eusebius gives you a public miracle adequate for the founding myth of a civilization. Neither account was written by a neutral observer. Both men had every reason to present Constantine as divinely chosen. The difference between their accounts is 22 years, and the difference between a private dream and a vision in the afternoon sky. That is the foundation of the official conversion narrative. And the foundation has two incompatible shapes. But here is the thing about ancient history. Sometimes you do not need to rely entirely on what people chose to write down. Sometimes you have the objects themselves. The Roman Imperial Mint was not in the business of ambiguity. Every coin produced by that mint was a political declaration. When Constantine's image appeared alongside a symbol or an inscription, that was not decoration. That was official ideology, state religion. The most powerful government in the Western world announcing in metal that changed hands across every province from Britain to Syria what it stood for. And the coins from 313 AD through 325 AD, the years immediately following the supposed conversion at Milvian Bridge, tell a specific story. Soli Invicto Comiti, to the unconquered son, companion of the emperor. That is the inscription on standard imperial coinage through most of this period. Sol Invictus, the unconquered son, was the solar deity that had become central to Roman imperial religion in the 3rd century. After his supposed conversion, Constantine continued to produce official coins showing Sol Invictus beside him, the solar rays around the deity's head, the sun god identified as his divine companion, his protector. In 313 AD, the same year as the Edict of Milan, the same year Christianity became a legal religion in Rome, Constantine had enormous gold medallions minted showing himself in the company of Sol Invictus. Enormous, official, gold, struck at the imperial mint and circulated as the face of imperial authority. The solar imagery does not disappear from the coinage until after 325 to 326 AD, over a decade after Milvian Bridge, more than a decade after the dream that was supposed to have changed everything. Now, I want to be precise about what this means because precision matters here. He did not become a Christian in 313 AD. He made Christianity legal in 313 AD. There is a significant difference between those two things. The Edict of Milan extended religious toleration to all religions. It was not a declaration of Christian faith. It was an act of political management, the kind of broad tolerance a ruler extends when he wants to stop making enemies he does not need to be making. Constantine kept the title of Pontifex Maximus, chief pagan priest of Rome, throughout his entire reign. It was not a title he relinquished. The coins are not rhetoric. They are not biography written by an admirer with reasons to flatter. They are objects. They sit in museums today. The British Museum has them. The American Numismatic Society has documented them in detail. You can look at them. And what they show year by year across the decade following the supposed conversion is a man who continued to present himself publicly as the chosen companion of a solar deity while simultaneously building Christian institutions. He did not become a Christian in 313 AD. He became neutral in 313 AD. That is not conversion. That is politics. And there is nothing surprising about a brilliant politician being good at politics. The surprise is what the institution built on that politics decided to call it afterward. 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea. The 318 bishops who gathered in the imperial city on the southern shore of the lake were there to resolve a theological crisis that was threatening the unity of the church across the Eastern Empire. The crisis was a dispute about the nature of Christ. On one side, Arius, a priest from Alexandria, who argued that Christ the Son was a created being, the first and greatest of God's creations, fully exalted but not co-eternal with the Father. There was a time, Arius taught, when the Son was not. On the other side, Alexander of Alexandria and his young deacon Athanasius, who argued that Christ was homoousios, of the same substance as the Father, not created, not secondary, fully divine, eternally begotten. The debate was not abstract to the men in that room. They had been fighting about it for years. Bishops had been exiled. Communities had split. Letters of denunciation had crossed the Mediterranean in both directions. By 325 AD, The church was no longer a persecuted sect. It had imperial patronage, property, legal standing, and the question of what Christ fundamentally was had become a question with institutional consequences that no one in that room could afford to ignore. Constantine opened the council. He sat at the center of the assembly hall. He wore his imperial purple. He addressed the gathered bishops in what was reportedly careful and polished Greek. He presided. He pressed for unity with the specific insistence of a man who understood that theological disagreement was also political fragmentation. When the debate stalled over the exact wording of the creed, it was Constantine's intervention that moved the council toward the homoousios formula. Bishops who were reluctant to sign were exiled. He did not attend Nicaea, he ran it. Stay with me on this for a moment, because the implication is not small. The men in that room were arguing about the most fundamental question in Christian theology: the nature of God, the relationship between Father and Son, the substance of divinity itself. They were deciding what every baptized Christian in the Roman world would be required to believe under penalty of condemnation and exile. They were doing this under the active presidency of a man who had not been baptized, who was not, by the definition of the very theology being debated in that room, a Christian. In the tradition these bishops were defending, baptism was the rite of initiation. You were not inside the church until you were baptized. Constantine was a catechumen, a candidate, an outsider still in the process of preparation. He was, by the standards of every bishop in that assembly, a man who had not yet fully entered the faith whose doctrine he was now arbitrating. That man presided over the vote that determined the doctrine of the Trinity. The bishops knew this. Every one of them knew what a catechumen was and what the difference between a catechumen and a baptized member of the church meant. They had every standing to raise the question. They did not raise it. Because the alternative, running Nicaea without imperial patronage, without the emperor's physical presence and political weight, was not, in 325 AD, a realistic option for an institution that had spent 3 centuries being persecuted by that same imperial power and was now standing inside the unprecedented warmth of imperial protection. The institution that the council produced needed Constantine more than it needed to insist on his qualifications to chair the meeting. 326 AD. 1 year after Nicaea, Constantine executed his eldest son. Crispus was not a marginal figure. He was a celebrated military commander, the general who had commanded the fleet at the Battle of the Hellespont, the campaign that destroyed Licinius's naval forces and gave Constantine sole control of the entire Roman Empire. He had been consul. He was married. He had a son. He was, in every practical sense, the heir apparent. In the late spring of 326 AD, Crispus was arrested and executed at Pola, in the Istrian Peninsula, without a recorded trial, without a public charge, without a surviving document that explains why. Months later, Fausta, Constantine's empress, the mother of 3 of his sons, was suffocated in an overheated bath. Again, no recorded trial, no public explanation, no surviving document. Damnatio memoriae followed both of them, the Roman practice of erasing a condemned person from official memory. Crispus's name was struck from inscriptions on monuments. His image was removed from public spaces. In the official record of the empire, he ceased to exist. And then there is Eusebius of Caesarea, the bishop who was Constantine's official biographer, the man who had written extensively and admiringly about Crispus in an earlier edition of the Vita Constantini, describing him as a brilliant and pious young man, praising his military achievements, treating him as the worthy heir of a great emperor. That edition no longer exists in its original form. What exists is the revised edition, the one in which Crispus has been removed. His official biographer, the man writing the story of the great Christian emperor, literally edited Crispus out of the book. No bishop from that era recorded a formal protest. No church father wrote a letter of pastoral rebuke. No official condemnation was issued from any pulpit in any province of the empire. The reason for that silence is not difficult to find if you follow it logically. Constantine was not subject to ecclesiastical jurisdiction. He was not a member of the church. A man who had not been baptized could not be threatened with excommunication. There was nothing to excommunicate him from. The institution that had built its entire political future on his patronage was not in a position to rebuke the patron. And beyond the politics, if Constantine was not by definition a Christian, then the church had no formal claim on his conduct. He had spent 25 years building the institution, and he was not in it. 337 AD, Nicomedia. Constantine was 65 years old and dying. In the spring of that year, he fell seriously ill while preparing for a military campaign against Persia. He traveled to the thermal baths near Nicomedia in hopes of recovery. He did not recover. At some point in those final weeks, he convened a group of bishops, and then for the first and only time in his 65 years, he was baptized. I want you to understand who performed the ceremony, because the detail matters more than it might seem. The bishop who baptized Constantine was not Eusebius of Caesarea, the official biographer, the great Nicene churchman, the man who had written the Vita Constantini. The bishop who baptized Constantine was a different man with the same first name, Eusebius of Nicomedia. Eusebius of Nicomedia had a documented history of sympathy with Arius. He had maintained correspondence with Arius during the period when Arius's position was under formal condemnation. After Nicaea, Eusebius of Nicomedia had been exiled, specifically because of that correspondence. He was later reinstated to his see and had become, in the final decade of Constantine's reign, one of the more influential figures in the Eastern Church. He was, by the doctrinal standard established at the Council of Nicaea, the council that Constantine himself had convened and presided over, a bishop of heretical sympathies. The emperor who had run the council that condemned Arianism died baptized by an Arian bishop. I have sat with that detail for a long time. The word ironic does not cover it. Revealing is closer. The man who built the institutional framework for Nicene Christianity received his only sacrament from a man who represented the heresy Nicaea was specifically called to defeat. Now I want to give you the theological context for the timing, because it is essential. In the early church, and this was not a fringe position, it was a well-established theological understanding. Baptism was the complete washing away of all sins committed before that moment. Not some sins, not the worst sins, all of them. The moment you emerged from the water, you were clean. Every act before that moment, regardless of its weight, was washed away. This was taught publicly. It was discussed in theological writing, and it had a practical consequence that early Christian writers acknowledged openly. Some people delayed baptism until near death, specifically to enter the water carrying the maximum weight of past sins, and to leave with the minimum time afterward in which new ones could accumulate. Constantine had served as Pontifex Maximus, chief pagan priest of Rome, for the entirety of his reign. He had presided over pagan religious practice as an official duty of his office. He had executed his son without trial. He had executed his wife without trial. He had ordered the damnatio memoriae of the people he killed. He had spent 25 years managing every religious and political calculation that the most powerful office in the Western world requires. He washed all of it away in the last days of his life. He spent 25 years as the architect of the church. He received the sacrament that made him a member of it when he had days left to live. Before I tell you about a conversation I have not stopped thinking about, and I will get to it, I want to make one clarification that I think is genuinely important because the church has not always been clear about it. Constantine did not make Christianity the mandatory religion of the Roman Empire. The historical record does not show that. The Edict of Milan in 313 AD granted religious toleration to all religions. It was a policy of pluralism, not Christian establishment. The polytheist temples kept functioning. The traditional priesthoods continued. The imperial cult was not dismantled. Constantine opened a door. The act that actually made Christianity mandatory, that closed the other doors, was the Edict of Thessalonica, issued in 380 AD by Emperor Theodosius I, 43 years after Constantine's death. Theodosius declared Nicene Christianity the sole legitimate religion of the empire. He prohibited pagan sacrifice. He began the systematic suppression of competing religious traditions. He made what Constantine had made possible into what the church eventually claimed had always been inevitable. Constantine opened the door. Theodosius closed all the others. That distinction matters. The story the Church has told, that the empire became Christian at Milvian Bridge, that Constantine's conversion turned the world, is a story about a single decisive opening. What actually turned the world was a different emperor making a different decision 4 decades later. The founding myth and the founding act are not the same event. I had a colleague at the school, a man named Don Whitfield, taught AP government, coached JV football for about 15 years. Don and I were not close in the way that means everything, but we were the kind of colleagues who share a lunch table 3 times a week for a decade, and that builds its own kind of familiarity. Don was a churchgoer, Methodist. He was not deeply interested in the finer points of doctrinal history, but he had opinions, and he was not shy about them. Early on in my research, I had been retired for a year or 2 and was starting to take some of this seriously. I mentioned the baptism to him. The basic fact: Constantine was not baptized until 337 AD on his deathbed at 65. I gave him the context, the coins, the timeline. Don listened. He processed it for a moment, the way he processed things, looking somewhere past my left shoulder. Then he said, "Well, I'm sure he believed, in his heart, not with argument, not with defensiveness, with the settled calm of a man who has decided that the foundations do not need to be examined, and that examining them is not something he needs to do." I understood the feeling. I had felt it myself for most of my adult life. I remember exactly where we were standing. The parking lot of the school after a Thursday evening faculty meeting. October, the leaves going in East Tennessee. That specific October cold that is not yet winter, but has stopped being fall. The kind of air that reminds you that things are ending. I remember not having a good answer in the moment. What do you say to, "I'm sure he believed in his heart"? I drove home with the radio off, and I kept turning the sentence over. And what I kept arriving at was this: "I'm sure he believed in his heart" is not a historical argument. It is a theological need. The need for the story to be what the Church has always needed it to be. The conversion that proved that faith can conquer empire, that the most powerful man in the Western world knelt before the carpenter's son. But the coins exist. The baptismal record exists. The biography that Eusebius of Caesarea rewrote to remove his murdered son exists. The documented sympathy for Arianism held by the man who performed the ceremony exists. The historical record, not interpretation, not hostile reading, not revisionism, is clear about the 25 years that sit between Milvian Bridge and the deathbed. I do not know what was in Constantine's heart. Neither does anyone else. What I know is what the documents say. This is where Spinoza comes in, not as an attack on what Constantine believed or did not believe, as a method for understanding what the institution did with the story afterward. In the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, the book he published in 1670 without his name on it, with a false city of publication, because he understood that the previous man who had written something similarly clear about power and religion had been found floating face down in an Amsterdam canal. Spinoza made an observation that I have not found improved upon in 3.5 centuries of subsequent scholarship. States do not convert to religions, they recruit them. A religion that exists as a persecuted minority is not in a position to verify the sincerity of an imperial patron. When the most powerful man in the Western world extends his protection, the institution that accepts the protection has acquired, along with everything else, something it was not in a position to trade away: the patron's story, his narrative, the official history of how he came to be their protector. Constantine did not become a Christian. Constantine recruited Christianity. He recruited a religion that had 3 centuries of martyrdom behind it, a tradition of suffering under imperial power that was about to become a tradition of imperial patronage. He gave it councils and legal standing, and the most sacred site in Jerusalem, and the political protection that turned a persecuted sect into a civilizational force. And in exchange, without anyone explicitly negotiating this, without a written contract, the institution that received all of that adopted the story the patron needed. The story of the vision at Milvian Bridge, grown from a dream into a public sign in the sky. The story of the great Christian emperor whose faith transformed the world, the story that the institution needed in order to explain to itself and to everyone else why the most powerful man in Rome had chosen it. The institution that formed around that patronage never corrected the record. It needed a founder. It needed the narrative that faith had triumphed over empire, because that narrative was the source of its moral authority across the centuries that followed. If Constantine had merely been a politician who found Christianity a more effective tool for imperial unity than Sol Invictus, the founding story lost its force. So, the story needed him to have believed. The coins say Sol Invictus for more than a decade after the supposed conversion. The record of the council he personally ran shows an unbaptized man arbitrating the most important theological question in Christian history. His official biographer revised his biography to erase the executed son. He was baptized at 65 in his final days by a bishop whose theological position was formally heretical by the standard of the council he had convened and controlled. Those are not interpretations. Those are documents. Paul Stevenson in Constantine, Roman Emperor, Christian Victor, describes the emperor's religious evolution as gradual, complex, and never fully resolved in the historical record. Peter Brown, in The World of Late Antiquity, locates Constantine in the long tradition of Roman rulers who understood religion as a tool of social cohesion and used it accordingly. Neither of them says what the stained glass says. The church was built on his patronage. He never joined it, that is the truth of it. Make of that what you will.